Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Hello, welcome back. In this episode, we'll begin to develop the founding of the British colonies in North America. Specifically, the colonies within the geography that would eventually be recognized as the 13 American colonies, and subsequently, the United States of America. Our focus long-term will be more easily understood by geography. Loosely, the New England colonies, the Middle colonies, and the Southern colonies. 3 clusters, if you will. And that model could change, but for now, we'll begin with the New England region. And this was not the first region that saw English permanence, but it's going to be our first area of focus. And that said, if you recall a while back, we introduced the European theater with a general map for review of the basic kind of lay of the land. Because I know that I can suffer from an imagined mastery of geography at times. I assume that we can all do that. So the goal is to set us up on the same page without the benefit of a visual aid. And this is an audio podcast. So you remember we used the illustration of a clock face to lay out the various players in Europe. And France was the epicenter of that clock face. Now that map is available for you at historywithjeff.com or at hgapodcast.libsyn.com. This new map will be available as well. So to understand our geography in this series, which we're going to be in for quite a while, we'll again employ that clock face as a way to introduce that cast of characters. This time it's the independent colonies. So imagine the clock face. And remember, we're not talking about a digital clock face, but rather a real clock face with numbers arranged in a circumference, evenly spaced from 1 to 12, with the 12 positioned at the top of the circle. A basic clock face. So to make this simple, in short, Connecticut is in the center of the clock face. And then if you move immediately to the east or to the right, starting at the number 3 is Plymouth Colony. And then moving counterclockwise, just above Plymouth Colony is Massachusetts Bay. And it moves up to about the 12. And there's where we find New Hampshire, and it's just a sliver. And from the 12 to 11 is Vermont. And New York can be found between the 11 and the 8. And slightly off the clock face, from the 8 to about the 6 is Pennsylvania. Now, inside the clock face, just a sliver, from the number 7 to the number 6 is Long Island. And just above Long Island is the Long Island Sound. Connecticut, back to Connecticut, the center of our clock face, is just opposite of the Long Island shoreline. And this is also where we'll find both New Haven and Fort Saybrook, 2 very short-lived colonies within Connecticut. And that's our bird's eye view of the geography that we're going to cover. And again, we'll be in this series for a number of weeks, possibly a number of months. So I know we worked through a good amount of pre-work, kind of background information, both from a European standpoint as well as the colonials themselves. But I do want to underscore the basic scenario again, with a little different take, kind of a review, but it's certainly worthwhile. And if you're just tuning in for the first time and you haven't heard the previous episodes, you might find this helpful as well. So I want to read a couple of quotes to kind of set the stage for the founding of colonial America from a book entitled We Americans. And this is actually a book, it's a compilation of various authors and historians adding their perspectives to the larger narrative. And so the first guy I want to quote from is named Lewis B. Wright. And it's from a chapter entitled Voyage to Eden. And so I think for the setup, we're probably all familiar with Christopher Columbus, right? The Italian mariner who sailed for Spain and quote unquote discovered the New World in 1492. But he wasn't the only influential Italian mariner, nor was Spain the sole beneficiary of this capable seafaring region. I mean, in reality, this region, encompassing today's Italy, was instrumental to several nations. The English had John Cabot. Now, that's a name that you might at least be familiar with from some distant history class in school. He sailed around the same time. And I want to quote, this is what Lewis B. Wright said. In 1497, John Cabot, a Venetian mariner, licensed by Henry VII of England, led an expedition to the northern reaches of America and took possession of, quote, unknown islands, unquote. His royal patron later called, quote, the new found land, end quote. Upon the mysterious voyage, Britain later based her claims to whatever territory she could seize from her rivals. Now that's an interesting thing because the French had their own Italian mariner champion. In 1524, France enlisted another Italian mariner, Giovanni di Verrazzano, a Florentine who sailed from Rouen on a voyage that took him to the Carolinas and then along the coast to Cape Breton Island and the same Newfoundland. Verrazzano's exploits and travels were extensive. From the Carolinas in the south, Cape Fear, North Carolina area, 50 years before Roanoke, to Cape Breton and again Newfoundland in the north, almost 30 years after John Cabot's claim for England. And the last two being modern Canada. And you can almost see the setup, the foreshadowing taking place a century before the English got serious about colonization. They had placed a claim on Newfoundland, and then just a little while later, France also places a claim on Newfoundland. Now, Verrazzano's an interesting guy. He was at Chesapeake Bay, and he was in the greater Virginia and Maryland region. He was in New York Harbor, and he sailed what was later to be known as the Hudson River. He saw Newport Bay and Narragansett Bay in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area. Verrazzano sailed Penobscot Bay in the area that would later be called Maine. It's a bay that would see a great American disaster during the Revolutionary War, and we'll talk about that probably a year from now. All of these places were visited by Verrazzano before they received their colonial names, names that we recognize today. His own reports were mixed about his encounters with the native peoples that he met. Most seemed admirable enough, but alas, Verrazzano would ultimately be killed and eaten by cannibals on a later voyage to the Caribbean. Frankly, obviously it was later. I mean, it was going to be his last voyage. He would not survive being eaten. But that's another whole discussion. So one more guy I want to quote before we go on is a guy named Edmund S. Morgan from a chapter entitled Working the American Land. And this particular set of quotes adds to the intrigue by highlighting some basic realities about life in England at the dawn of American colonialism. I want to read a couple of paragraphs. I want to kind of set it up, read the paragraphs, and then I just want to say a couple of really brief words about each one. Again, just to set the stage, this is a slightly different twist on what we've already talked about in a couple of previous episodes. So Edmund S. Morgan had this to say: becoming an American has never been easy. The Englishmen who first tried it at Jamestown and Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay found that they had much to learn and more to unlearn. Whether they came looking for a way to wealth or a way to righteousness, they had to begin by staying alive, by making a living, and making a living in the New World required a whole new set of ideas and attitudes. So the first thing that we want to realize is that coming to America, this was a big move. And these were brave people, willing to risk everything. I mean, frankly, when we think about what they had back in England, a lot of times these were people that had nothing to lose and everything to gain. So Morgan goes on, quote, the England that the settlers left behind had become a puzzle to its inhabitants. For a century, people had been multiplying at a rate that almost surpassed the capacity of the island to support them. Jobs were scarce. The cost of food had soared. The government did what it could to spread the work around, to hold down the number of artisans so that each would have business to support him. Laws required young men to serve long apprenticeships before setting up in trade for themselves. Employers had to hire by the year, not by the day or hour or job. It was illegal to practice more than one trade. labor was divided, not for efficiency's sake, but to multiply jobs. The making of a bow and arrow, for example, was shared by 4 workers, one who rough-hewed bow staves, a bowyer who finished them, an arrowhead maker, and a fletcher." End quote. So it was difficult to get ahead in England, even with skills or ambition. And I think that the example we used in our last episode was the gunsmith, where there was like 20-something guys that were required to actually put a gun together and maintain it. So again, continuing with Edmund S. Morgan, moving from the artisans to the farm, quote, "Some farming tasks, too, became the preserve of specialists. Many villages had but one plow and one team to pull it, and only after the plowman had done his work could the ordinary farmer or husbandman plant his fields. Whether a man tilled his own land or labored for someone else, he had to coordinate his tasks with those assigned to others, and they would resent and perhaps even prosecute an overeager individualist who tried to do for himself a job that rightly belonged to another." End quote. So even the rough country life was made rougher by design. Morgan continues, quote, "Farmland, like work, was scarce in England. It had to be used continuously and intensively in order to nurse from it as much food as possible, and few men could afford farmland. The island also had hilly, wooded lands too rough to till. To these wastelands, especially in the north and west, drifted men and women who could find no land or work elsewhere. They squatted and made do, living from scrawny gardens, wild nuts and roots, and animals that foraged in the woods. Not wild animals, only aristocrats could hunt, but the cows and pigs that an ordinary man might raise on the common land. At best, he went hungry much of the time. At worst, he turned to thieving and ended up in the gallows. The number of thieves, rogues, and tramps rose even higher. It seemed to John Winthrop, future governor of Massachusetts Bay, that the land, quote, grows weary of her inhabitants, end quote." Now, consider these things in light of the almost constant religious threat and strife that everybody in England was living under. It didn't matter if you were Anglican, Protestant, or Catholic. Everybody was kind of taking their turns getting abused. And then lastly, if you'll just allow me one more quote, Morgan continued, quote, "The English found a vast land thinly peopled by the native Indians. The first Spanish conquerors in Mexico had faced a country of 25 million people with an intensive agriculture. By contrast, the English encountered only 8 to 10,000 Indians in the Virginia area and probably no more than twice that many in all of New England. The settlers quickly outnumbered the native peoples, whose small tribes, already reduced from the onslaught of European diseases and firearms, became rapidly smaller." End quote. So the situation in England, coupled with the opportunity in America, seems like a perfect storm for permanent relocation and settlement. And so it was for many people. Now, the first group that we want to look at are the folks who settled Plymouth Colony, remembered collectively as the Pilgrims. They represent a wonderful cross-section of virtually everything going on in Europe at that time. It's a cross-section of virtually everything going on in Europe for a century. And here's their story in part. I mean, we'll develop their larger storyline as we develop the greater New England landscape in just a few weeks. But to begin with, Plymouth Colony, recognized as the second successful permanent English colony in North America, was founded by the Pilgrims. Now, as I attempt to keep these groups straight in my own head, these were the folks within the Puritan movement. By Puritan, we understand their views as not believing in the English Reformation or the birth of Anglicanism. They didn't think that Anglicanism had gone far enough in its quest to leave Catholicism. But the Pilgrims were even more serious, quote-unquote, theologian types in their doctrine than the Anglicans, and they were more serious than the Puritans. Remember, King Henry left the Catholic Church for his own reasons, not specifically ecclesiastical. The Puritans wanted a greater purge from Catholicism, and the Pilgrims wanted an even quicker purge from Catholicism. So the Puritans, for a time, were content with staying within the Anglican community and trying to purify it. There was disagreement within that movement is to the degree of tolerance. The Pilgrims represented a kind of hardline faction. They did not wish to reform the Anglican Church. They wanted to leave it. Their movement began in 1605 in the northern part of England. You remember we just read that was a tough place to make a living. Their belief was that true churches were made of voluntary democratic communities. They weren't made of a nation. It's not a state church that coerced allegiance. So after the very real existential threat of a return to English national Catholicism had passed, the English state church, the Anglican Church, under the Stuart monarchy, began to institute policies that restricted free thought and encouraged uniformity. This, to the Pilgrims, was unacceptable. The Pilgrims took the greatest, quickest offense to these measures. The Puritans took a little longer, but they too would ultimately come to recognize the power of the Anglican Church. And they too would be threatened. And they too would seek asylum in the New World. So the Pilgrims were religious dissidents, primarily from the north of England. Many fled England to other more accepting nations on the European continent. You remember, we're looking at, 75, 80 years after the Reformation. But the group that we want to consider is the folks who ended up in the Netherlands by 1609, in the city of Leiden in Holland. And here again, I referenced this in the previous series. We see how Elizabeth's assistance to the Netherlands had come full circle. She assisted them in not just sustaining their existence, but separating from Catholic Spain. And now it's actually English dissidents that are finding refuge in Holland. The term pilgrim is a common term for us today. It's usually accepted without a whole lot of critique. I mean, we have this idea of what a pilgrim is. But what does it really mean? How does the monicum of pilgrim help to identify and explain exactly who these folks were, how they felt, what their vision actually was, both in Leiden, in Holland, and then in the New World? So we want to understand that the term quote-unquote pilgrim it's believed was first coined of this group by William Bradford in his personal account of the 1620 adventure that began in Leiden. And it refers to the Old Testament Hebrews as mentioned in the New Testament book of Hebrews in the Holy Bible. And I wanted to read from you the exact quote that Bradford was talking about. And I'll read this from the King James Version of the Bible, probably pretty close to what he might have had. Wouldn't normally be my first choice, but I will read from the King James Version of the Bible. And this comes from the book of Hebrews again, chapter 11, verses 13 through 16. Now, chapter 11 of Hebrews is this famous chapter of Scripture where it's talking about all of the great men of faith throughout the ages until the time of the book of Hebrews was written. And so previously it speaks of Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham. And so by the time it gets to verse 13, it tells us these all died in faith. Again, the reference to the patriarchs, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. End quote. So again, William Bradford labeled his own people and himself, he counted himself among the pilgrims, as those strangers and pilgrims upon the land seeking out their own country, not willing to go back to the country that they had come from, believing that God had something better. And it would be another 150 years before that label would be used outside of a direct quote from Bradford, and another 200 years until Daniel Webster popularized it at the bicentennial celebration. So the point of that is that the term pilgrim is a modern term, really, when you think about it. They wouldn't have thought of themselves necessarily that way. They wouldn't have been spoken about that way necessarily in everyday vernacular like we would today. So they fled from England in 1609, but there were other wheels in motion as they were fleeing. plans and attempts at colonization in the New World north of Virginia. So from 1606 to 1609, there was a commercial trading company, the Plymouth Company, that was founded by King James. And the intended goal was to colonize the east coast of North America. I mean, of course, the Dutch and the French and the Spanish had these goals as well. The Plymouth Company is also remembered as the Virginia colony of Plymouth. In 1607, they settled a colony in present-day Maine, Popham Colony. It failed. And at the same time, the sister company, the London Company, was establishing Jamestown, as well as other colonies to the south. So the Plymouth Company was inactive then from 1609 to 1620, but it was then reorganized under a new charter, the Council for New England. Now, this is a big deal in hindsight, the Council for New England. Although it only lasted 15 years, it was this charter that really opened the doors for colonization in the New England region. Because along with Plymouth Colony, the state of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay Colony, New Haven Colony, and ultimately the area known as the state of Maine were all founded under this arrangement. Possibly the most influential man associated with its formation was Sir Ferdinand Gorges, an influential, ambitious man of his day, and yet almost forgotten in ours. We may circle back to him. But for right now, let's go back to Leiden. The Pilgrims were tolerated in their new home, but life was hard for them. And although estranged from their homeland, they wanted to remain English. So as time went on, they feared that they would lose their heritage and be absorbed into the larger Dutch population. I mean, the reality is they weren't attracting very many new followers in their new home. And the Dutch population, by Pilgrim standards, was far too liberal. I mean, go figure, thanks for your hospitality and security. Thanks for letting us harbor here, but no thanks. Makes you wonder, are these guys ever happy? That's a little bit of sarcasm. They had a vision in mind, as we read from the book of Hebrews, and a new country that would be provided by God. The Netherlands, they decided, was not it. And at this time, there still remained the very real threat that Spain would take these Dutch separatists back. And then where would that leave the English dissidents, right? I mean, Spain would take the Dutch separatists back, they'd be ticked off enough, but if they found English people living there, that would be a double threat. So the Pilgrims began to look to the New World. I mean, life would be harsh, but they'd be free to organize how they wanted to. So at the same time, there was a prominent English politician, Sir Edwin Sandys, who, like Ferdinando Gorges, was instrumental in much of the English ambition and success in the New World. Now, Edwin Sandys was operating more south, right? So Ferdinando Gorges was farther north in the New England area. But Edwin Sandys was operating in the south. The Plymouth colony, geographically, was right in the middle of both of these men. Sandys was one of the founders of the Virginia Company of London, and he was there when Jamestown was established. And also, the colony of Sandys in Bermuda was named after him. In 1619, Sandys became the treasurer of the Virginia Company. And this is where the story gets interesting, because it was under his leadership that the real push for permanence was launched through aggressive programs. It was Sandys who encouraged women to move to the New World. They didn't have women in Jamestown for like a decade. Think about that. Let that sink in. But Sandys knew if women went to the New World, they would have children and they would have families, and that would encourage a sense of permanence, and people would work harder for development. He granted land to the early settlers by 100 or 50-acre plots. Think about that. You're in England, you're never going to own land. You're stuck waiting for the guy with the plow to come and plow your fields when he gets to you. And yet this guy Sandys is going to set you up with 100 or 50-acre plots. He encouraged indentured servitude. He actually sent company workers to work the land for profit for the Virginia Company. So for our conversation, it was Sandys who was looking for colonists, just as the Pilgrims were looking for opportunity. You see how this is brewing. Sandys even lent the Pilgrims 300 pounds without interest to help them on their way. So again, the Pilgrims, although estranged from their homeland, wanted to remain English. And as time went on, they feared that they would lose their heritage and be absorbed into the larger Dutch population. A population that by Pilgrim standards was way too liberal. But they had a vision in mind, a new country that would be provided by God, and the Netherlands was not it. Now, I did just repeat myself. I did that on purpose because, again, using that idea of the transparencies that we've talked about in previous episodes, I want to kind of lay this out. There's a lot of moving parts here. There aren't going to be this many moving parts with some of the other colonies, but Plymouth, because of their geography and because they were the first permanent settlement to stick basically up north, we want to take our time and understand this. So again, I want to present this kind of in layers. So let's back up again and remember that the Pilgrims sitting in Leiden recognized Holland was not their home. They were looking to the New World where they knew that life would be harsh, but they'd be free. So with that consideration, there were two viable regions as far as the Pilgrims were concerned as they were sitting in Leiden, Holland. And the first was Virginia near Jamestown. They knew that had been successful. I mean, at least they'd survived. The second was the Hudson River area. Well, we call it the Hudson River today. That would eventually be claimed by the Dutch. I know we reviewed that in the previous series. But the region was still attractive as it would allow for a certain autonomy, but it would also be close to other European settlements. I mean, you're moving what they felt like to the middle of nowhere, right? The other side of the world. So even if you're going to do that and you're going for liberty, religious liberty, political liberty, whatever it is, it would be nice to know, a little comforting to know, that there are some folks in kind of the same geographic neighborhood that had some of the same background as you do. So they received sanction by the London Company in June of 1619, with one stipulation, that their religion would not receive official recognition. So after a short back and forth with some Dutch factions, there were some controversies, as well as the resolution of some outstanding controversies with the London Company itself, they received their land grant for the area north of Virginia to be called New England and recognized separate from the Virginia region. I mean, it does kind of intrigue me. Again, here's another one of those transparencies, how important colonization was to the crown. Because nothing was happening without the crown's approval. I mean, these guys essentially were ecclesiastical enemies, right? They so couldn't tolerate Anglicanism, they moved out of England. And yet the king so desperately wants permanence and colonies in North America that he's willing to grant them a charter. I mean, remember, there's a lot of money to be made in the European colonial games. Enough that a small thing like religion, I mean, they've only fought like 100 years worth of wars over it, would not get in the way of making money. As with all political ambitions, whether of the state or the individual, rules can be broken and indiscretions can be overlooked, and often are, if they afford the advancement of the larger agenda. Do you agree with that? I think that's true, right? I mean, as with all political ambitions, whether of state or individual, rules can be broken and indiscretions overlooked, and often are, if they afford the advancement of the larger agenda. It's the expediency of the situation that makes for situational ethics. And I think the greatest illustration, at least for me, from the American experience of this concept is the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, you realize there was no legal ability to make that purchase, right? There's no constitutional way to have actually made the Louisiana Purchase. It simply offered too much gain in land and security to ignore. And I think the especially humorous thing to me that smacks of the expediency of the situation is that it was Thomas Jefferson who secured that purchase. This is the guy who preferred to be a medium-sized agrarian state, and yet he basically illegally doubled the size of our country, all in the name of expediency. That's just like the Pilgrims when they were granted their charter. So it was in Leiden, as they incubated for a decade, that the Pilgrims learned the necessary skills that they would need for life in the New World. I mean, it was in Leiden as urban immigrants, I mean, with all of the connotations intended in that phrase, urban immigrants, that they learned to support themselves in the skilled trades of textiles and printing and brewing, among other things. By 1620, they were ready to leave Leiden, both in spirit and perhaps more importantly, in newfound abilities. And the plan was that a small group would make the initial voyage along with a hired crew. Now, how this unfolded is pretty incredible. Remember, men like Fernando Gorges and Edwin Sandys were both very active at this time, both in the North and the South. And their respective work would have great influence and impact on the Pilgrims and their Puritan brethren that would soon join them in the New World. And to fully appreciate their success, I try to keep the whole concept of quote-unquote New World in perspective, not as I've heard about it or how we framed the activity, but how they understood what they were doing. So here's a question. Have you ever set out with a vision for something that you believe in, something you prepare for, something that you want to be good at or succeed in? How often are those times as easy as these seem like they should be? I mean, it's easy to judge from a distance or to nitpick, but it's often harder to quote unquote do something than it is to imagine doing it, right? I mean, you can study the art of ditch digging all you want to, but grab a shovel and jump in, boys. I mean, it's a lot harder to dig the ditch than to figure out from an engineering perspective how to dig a ditch. Politicians are like that too. They need advisors, right? I mean, politicians know this because they're the visionaries. They want to get things done, but they don't always have the hands-on expertise of how to do it. So what they offer is the vision of what could be done, and they surround themselves with people that can actually get the task done. It's not easy to be a trailblazer. Trailblazers should be admired. And sadly, often those that observe from a distance, either a distance of time or space, don't fully appreciate what's being accomplished the first time around. New realities, new challenges, new enemies, new everything. I mean, think about like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Those guys connected the world and forever changed how we live and do business in the modern world. Social media, guys like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook or Jack Dorsey from Twitter, the social media guys, they've changed how we communicate and how we connect and how we stay in touch forever. And so too, in the world of the Pilgrims, they should be remembered as trailblazers along the same lines. They weren't the first. They weren't even the second attempt, not by England and certainly not by the greater European community, because success often rises out of the ashes of failure. There had been numerous English attempts prior to Plymouth. We've spoken about Roanoke and we've spoken about Jamestown a little bit, but there was also Guyana. And oddly enough, there was an Anglo-Dutch Puritan cooperative in 1597, led by Francis Johnson of Amsterdam, to the Magdalen Islands off of Newfoundland. And there was Martin Forbisher's voyages back in the 1570s off of Baffin Island, north of Labrador and west of Greenland. Maine in 1607 saw the Chajadohek colony, or the Propham colony. We've already mentioned that. George Popham and Raleigh Gilbert. And the Catholics also had their attempts. George Calvert had Avalon in Newfoundland. All of these attempts had failed. But all of these attempts contributed to the national experience, to the national growth and competence in planting a colony. Specific men, too, had influence, both on how they envisioned colonization and in different regions. Remember, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, we talked about him. He was a director of the Crown's Council in the 1620s. He was not a Puritan and he wasn't reformed. He was a governor of Plymouth in England, as well as a naval and military commander that was involved in virtually every major endeavor of their times. I'm talking the Armada, the troops that were kept in the Netherlands. He was involved in France with Henry Navarre. He was also involved in Essex's rebellion, but he did escape punishment. But his vision was not for this religious freedom and liberty thing. His vision was for a feudal society patterned after Europe's feudal society. You remember, I've been saying that these guys thought like medieval men. He wanted to transplant a feudal society from Europe to Maine. He doesn't appear to have been a self-government liberty kind of guy. And he was a shareholder in the Plymouth Company, and he helped to found the unsuccessful Popham Colony. One of his partners was John Mason, a man that we're going to talk about quite a bit in future episodes. And these two guys received a patent from the Crown's Plymouth Council for New England in 1622. And they founded the colony of Maine. And in 1629, they split into two parts. Gorges kept Maine, but Mason received the southern part of Maine, which came to be known as New Hampshire. Now, this is important. Remember, these guys are not Reformed. They're not Puritans. We're going to talk about that in episodes coming up. I think I mentioned it last time, but that certainly is part of the storyline for New England. But Gorges also wanted to establish a city, Gorgiana, to be the center of Anglicanism in the region. He's a very interesting guy. So another region of English/Protestant activity early on was in the Caribbean. And this is important because these men too are going to play a role later on in our series. In the 1620s, Lord Brooke, the Earl of Warwick, and Lord Say and Seal founded Providence Island in the Caribbean, and their expressed interest was to spread the Reformed gospel. Remember, the Caribbean is Spanish Catholic territory. And their vision, too, was not of self-governance, but of one that they made. So these two lords would play an influential role in New England, especially in Connecticut. And there were also unsuccessful attempts in South America going back decades at this point. John Calvin himself had handpicked some colonists decades earlier. Those colonies failed. Even the success at Jamestown could be challenged at this time. I mean, to a degree. Jamestown had been settled in 1607, but within 3 years, about 90% of the original 500 colonials had died. And it was consumption of the dead that may have allowed some of these folks to continue living. That's kind of gross. But in the case of Jamestown, those who survived offered a destination to later colonists. And a decade later, 4,000 more folks had come. Now, of those, a majority would die from a host of reasons, including attacks by natives. But the point is that Jamestown survived, and they did attract more people. People grew in their confidence to come. And so it was in Plymouth. Even the original investors would abandon them, and that debt had to be paid by those who stayed. The point that I'm getting at is when we develop Plymouth is English colonization, the successful kind, it took time. It took bravery, and it took building on the failures of the past. And as I said earlier, it was in Leiden, as they incubated for a decade, that the Pilgrims learned the necessary skills that they would need for life in the New World. It was in Leiden, as urban immigrants, with all of the connotations intended, that they learned to support themselves in the skilled trades of textiles and printing and brewing, among other things. But by 1620, they were ready to leave. And the plan was that a small group would make the initial voyage along with the hired crew. And so they left the Netherlands in July on a ship called the Speedwell. This was an older ship with a very storied past. It had been among the vessels that fought the Spanish in the Spanish Armada in 1588. But it would later prove to be too broken down to make the journey across the Atlantic. And so its companion ship, a bigger vessel, would make the trip alone with a consolidated passenger list and supplies. And this bigger sister vessel was the Mayflower. It might be a name now, again, synonymous with colonization and with bravery and, again, with the Pilgrims. But it was, in its day, quite the opposite of the Speedwell. It was not a very storied vessel, not very well known. There's very few records of her before this voyage. The Mayflower was 180 tons, and it left the shores of North America in September of 1620. And it was carrying, I'm going to say this, about 102 passengers, men, women, children of the Pilgrim separatists, as well as others. I say about 102 because that seems to be where most accounts are, but you can get accounts that say 100 or 101. The reality is they probably didn't have accurate records with everybody. We don't really know, but that's what we're going to go with. So one breakdown that I found on a website called blog.genealogybank.com listed 37 pilgrims, 32 recruited by Thomas Weston of the London Merchant Adventurers, non-pilgrims, 18 adult women, 13 of which would die the first winter, 10 girls, and 34 boys. Now, according to this website, the last of these Mayflower passengers was Mary Allerton, who died in 1699. She was 3 years old when they sailed across the ocean. So they're kind of sketchy numbers. I mean, History.com said 102 passengers, and it counts them as 50 men and 19 women and 33 young adults and children, only 41 of which had been pilgrims. So I'm always a little leery. I know I've said this before. I'm always a little leery to throw numbers out from these time frames because sometimes the records weren't quite as accurate. And sometimes as archaeology or new records are dug up or found, or resurface, sometimes those numbers change based on the time frame of what article you're reading or what author that you're reading. So at any rate, here's my long drawn out, that's who the Pilgrims were. The crew was headed by Master Christopher Jones. It was composed of 44 men, 30 crewmates, including a cook, a carpenter, a cooper, and a surgeon, 19 servants, 13 of those were for the Pilgrims, and 6 were for the merchant adventurers. And along the difficult journey, there were 2 deaths and 1 birth. I mean, imagine that. You're on this ship. It's going to end up being like 3 months they're on the Mayflower. 3 months you're on this boat. 3 months. I can't imagine that poor woman was very happy. What a way to enter the world. So, along with the people, there were documented at least 2 dogs. And there were pigs and goats and chickens. The larger animals would come later. And of these original folks on the Mayflower, the first winter would claim 45 lives. So, depending again on who you're reading, roughly 65 days later, first week of November, land was finally sighted, and it was Cape Cod. After a failed attempt to sail toward the Hudson River, they anchored at Princetown Harbor, outside of Virginia Company territory. That posed a problem, because if they were outside of Virginia Company territory, the logic was they were outside of the law. And William Bradford wrote of the peril for the small group at this time. Success, they realized, would only come with as many people as possible working together. I mean, there had to be some assurances. There had to be some cooperation. And as far as the crew was concerned, as far as the passengers were concerned, they were outside of the bounds of the law. So the document that came to be known as the Mayflower Compact was drafted aboard the Mayflower and signed by 41 men, including Miles Standish and William Bradford and John Carver and William Brewster. It promised cooperation, tolerance, and liberty among the settlers for the general good of the colony. And once ratified, it represented 73 males and 29 females, which brings us to our number 102. One thing I think is interesting is that the Pilgrims took this voyage with non-Pilgrim people, right? So they leave England because they can't stand the Anglican Church and they're not going to conform. And then they leave Holland because even though they don't have to conform, it's too liberal for them because they want to be separatists. They want to be themselves. And yet when they finally get to the New World, they have this Mayflower Compact where they promise cooperation, tolerance, and liberty among the settlers. I always find that kind of ironic. So it was John Carver who signed first, and he's also the first governor of Plymouth Colony. This compact was not only one of the quote-unquote seeds of American democracy, it's recognized as the first written constitution in America. So as they began to explore the area, they found signs of previous English activity. You remember, the English have been all over the coastlines here. But what they found included a house with cleared fields that had been recently cultivated. They came across the buried native corn. They took some of that for later use. Now, in December, sickness began to set in. Horrible sickness. They're still on the boat. Most were afflicted, nasty coughs and scurvy. Do you know what scurvy is? I had to look it up to make sure. I've heard scurvy. When I hear the word scurvy, I know it's bad. I'll cringe a little bit. But I was so familiar with the name, I really didn't know what it was. So it's a particularly ugly disease that's caused by a deficiency of vitamin C. Now listen to the symptoms of scurvy. It includes muscle pain, okay, bleeding gums, tooth loss. How gross is that? Seriously, that's gross. Their mouths must have stunk. I always say, people stink. Like if you get close to people, very few people don't stink. We stink. I can't imagine bleeding gums and tooth loss. How bad those people must have reeked. Skin rashes and bruising and coiled hair. And then the last one, when I looked this up, the last symptom was irritability. Well, I guess so. You're in pain. Your gums are bleeding, your teeth are falling out, you got rashes all over your skin, you bruise, your hair has coiled, probably not your best day. But that's what was happening aboard this ship. They're still on the Mayflower. So exploring the local area continued, though. They were sailing in a smaller vessel that had been brought aboard the Mayflower and, transported across the ocean. So they came ashore on the Nauset people's land. And the Nauset people fled. So the Pilgrims camped overnight on the shore amid the cries of the natives in the darkness. I mean, imagine it's winter time, right? This is New England. You're on the coastline and it's December and you're camping on the shoreline. I don't think they had Coleman back then. So you're camping on the shoreline, could not have been comfortable. And all night long, you hear the cries of the natives in the darkness. Just beyond the hedgerow. At morning, the natives attacked with bows and arrows. Now, the Pilgrims returned fire with their guns, and they drove the natives off, thankfully. But the reality is, the natives had already had some encounters with the English, encounters that had not gone so very well. I mean, it had been, quite some time since they had been in contact with English fishermen and traders on the coast. Men like John Hunt, a contemporary of John Smith, had taken several natives of the Patuxet and the Nauset tribes with the intent to sell them as slaves in Europe. They went to Spain first. And one of these men was named Squanto, a Patuxet native. And he was converted to Christianity in Spain and later went to England where he learned English. And from there, he eventually made his way back to the Cape Cod area. He'd been gone about 10 years. But upon returning, he found that his village was gone, mostly lost to disease. The year was 1619. And here's the providence of this. The Pilgrims arrived the following year. And Squanto, in spite of his previous hardship and heartbreak, no doubt, over how his life had gone, became a friend of the Pilgrims. I mean, maybe he figured that God providentially spared him from perishing. I think I'd be a pretty bitter guy. But apparently Squanto was not. So anyways, Squanto was just one of many natives that the English would encounter that could speak English. One of many natives that would help them early on. In fact, the Pilgrims didn't just receive help from the natives. The more established Dutch also offered early assistance to the Pilgrims. And this, again, this is before the Anglo-Dutch wars to come. So they hadn't very long in the past already had like this joint colony type of thing. The Dutch are here now. They do kind of have the same religious doctrine. So when the Pilgrims came, the Dutch offered them assistance. And again, as we talked about in earlier episodes, and we will again in about 40 years, there were going to be a series of Anglo-Dutch wars on who would actually conquer the world, right? I mean, so there were situations of both friction and cooperation between the English and the Dutch for decades. Frankly, decades and decades. Another account tells the tale of the Pokanokets, and they too experienced the horror of having many of their people kidnapped by the English. But their people weren't taken to Europe and sold into slavery. They were shot on board the English ship that took them. So through various other trials, including a 2-day delay in the elements due to a broken rudder and a night landing in strange waters, they came upon a previously cleared area on the mainland, celebrated as Forefathers' Day in Massachusetts. This is the landing, this small party that had been sent out from the Mayflower. This is the landing and discovery generally remembered as the landing at Plymouth Rock. The cleared area surrounded by hills had been abandoned by the natives due to plague. The exploration party returned to the Mayflower. At this point, it was 25 miles away, and returned 3 days later, and the settlement hill was chosen. Now, the initial quarters, again, we're going into wintertime here, so they didn't have a lot of time to prepare, and the initial quarters were very tight. Single men were forced to join in dwelling with one of the 19 families to save the energy of building additional houses. And again, I'm kind of a private person. I mean, in all honesty, I love my family to pieces, but sometimes they're too much for me to live with. So I can just imagine how uncomfortable this time must have been. How did they perceive this? I mean, these are a hardy people to begin with. Not only moving from England to Holland, but then picking up skills and recognizing Holland wasn't right. And then going through all of the motions of getting the charter and all of the planning, right? And then they come to the New World, they spend 3 months on a ship. And they're experiencing scurvy. I mean, these people aren't in the best of shape right now. And on top of that, then you have these squalid living conditions, and you got, I don't know, a wife and 2 or 3 kids, whatever it is. And then there's this guy that you do know, you've been on a boat with him for 3 months, but some guy you barely know is suddenly shacking up with you. I mean, this whole thing just sounds really uncomfortable to me. Again, the concept of the trailblazers, and we can make these into these, short paragraphs and these short snippets and how quaint that was. But when you think about the things that they were experiencing, the endurance day to day, it's almost like a Chinese water torture to me. Like, how many more aggravating things can happen for how much longer? I mean, a lot of the folks had already died by this time anyways. The journey aboard the Mayflower had begun 3 months earlier. And the reality is, though, by March, about half the people would have perished. There were times throughout that winter between December and March when only a small minority of the people were actually able-bodied enough to care for all of the sick. But there was a bright side to March as well. As the winter was giving way to better weather, Plymouth Colony signed a peace treaty with Massasoit of the Wampanoags. Now, Massasoit is a man whose reputation and legacy would outlive his physical life. We're going to talk about him again later. He's a very important figure, not only for the Pilgrims at Plymouth, but Massasoit is a pretty important figure for the native tribes in New England. And they had survived the journey, they had survived the natives, they had survived disease, they survived the winter, and they were now on their way. And so was the founding of the second successful permanent English colony in North America. More than a decade had passed since the founding of Jamestown, but these 2 colonies would prove to be the foothold that England needed to eventually secure the French claims, as well as the Dutch, and secure the eastern shoreline of North America, all for herself. And we'll be visiting Plymouth again in the context of the larger New England narrative. Next time we're together, we'll begin to develop the story of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, however. But for this time, I hope the opening narrative of the English colonial successes has helped the history to really come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com. and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.